Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the unfolding chapters of General Hospital take the audience into one of the darkest and most suspenseful storylines in recent memory, with Stella, Curtis, and Drew locked in a web of betrayal, manipulation, and devastating consequences. Drew, whose hunger for control has grown into a dangerous obsession, believed he could eliminate Stella by orchestrating a high-stakes insurance fraud investigation. In his mind, Stella was not simply a kind-hearted hospital figure but the hidden hand quietly maneuvering behind the scenes to shield Martin and ensure his survival in a cutthroat environment. With this conviction, Drew set the wheels in motion, convinced that exposing Stella would not only destroy her reputation but also re-establish his dominance in Port Charles. What he never expected, however, was that his accusations would set off a chain reaction far beyond his control, turning his schemes into the very weapon that would boomerang back on him. For Stella, the fallout was catastrophic. Long revered as the steady soul of the hospital, she had been the confidant and protector of countless lives. But being targeted so brutally, dragged into interrogations by relentless agents, and having her character questioned at every turn broke through the layers of resilience she had built over a lifetime. The strain overwhelmed her body. Beneath her calm exterior, her heart faltered under the immense pressure until it finally betrayed her with a sudden and near-fatal attack. The image of Stella collapsing on the sterile floors of the hospital sent shockwaves through Port Charles, a symbol of innocence toppled by cruelty. Lucas, driven by his oath and his personal devotion to those he cared for, fought tirelessly in the emergency room to keep Stella alive. In that desperate battle for survival, the community saw both the fragility of Stella and the cruelty of Drew's actions, though Drew himself remained blind to the storm he had unleashed. Curtis, who had endured betrayals, tragedies, and moments of profound loss, could no longer restrain his rage. Seeing Stella broken, fighting for her life, ignited a fire in him that nothing could extinguish. Drew's ruthless ambition had crossed a line that could never be erased. For Curtis, this was no longer about justice in a courtroom or apologies whispered too late, it was about retribution, about delivering a blow so precise and devastating that Drew would never rise again. Outwardly, Curtis projected anguish and fury, but behind closed doors, his mind sharpened into the clarity of a strategist preparing for war. And here is where the twist begins to take shape. Stella, even as she lay recovering, refused to see herself merely as a victim. Her body may have betrayed her, but her mind remained sharp, her instincts honed by years of understanding people and anticipating danger. In secret conversations with Curtis, she began to plot, not only for survival but for revenge. The two of them forged a pact, not born of cruelty, but of necessity. They would turn Drew's own arrogance against him. They would let him believe he had won, let him bask in the false glow of victory, while in reality every step he took drew him deeper into the trap that Stella and Curtis had designed. Their plan was intricate, relying on false trails, manufactured documents, and a carefully staged sequence of moves that would frame Drew as the true mastermind of fraud. Stella and Curtis understood Drew's personality well enough to anticipate his missteps. His ego made him careless, his obsession with domination made him blind to subtlety, and his belief in his own invincibility made him an easy target for manipulation. While he pushed the investigation forward, convinced Stella had been crushed, he failed to see the walls tightening around him. Curtis had allies both inside and outside the hospital, people willing to help disguise the paper trail and create convincing evidence. Stella provided the credibility, her years of service and goodwill making any suggestion of her innocence more believable than Drew's accusations. As Drew became increasingly entangled in his own plot, the irony grew sharper, the hunter had become the hunted. Each document he uncovered, each lead he pursued, only served to point suspicion back at him. Curtis and Stella remained in the shadows, patient, relentless, allowing Drew to step deeper into the abyss. By the time he realized the ground beneath him had given way, it was too late. What began as his attempt to unmask Stella had turned into the perfect illusion, one designed to make Drew the villain in the very narrative he tried to control. This storyline not only heightens the drama but underscores the delicate balance between power, arrogance, and resilience. Drew, consumed by his own ambition, underestimated Stella's resolve and Curtis's unyielding loyalty. Stella, despite her fragile health, transformed her suffering into a weapon of strategy, proving that even when pushed to the brink of death, she would not be defeated. Curtis, long underestimated for his emotional intensity, revealed himself to be as ruthless as any adversary when the people he loved were threatened. Together, they crafted a reckoning that would strip Drew of everything: his reputation, his power, his alliances, leaving him with nothing but the ruins of his own hubris. The brilliance of Stella and Curtis's trap lies in its irony. Drew believed he was orchestrating her downfall, but instead, he was digging his own grave. This was more than vengeance, it was justice delivered in a form no one in Port Charles had anticipated. And as Drew's empire of deceit began to collapse, Stella's quiet strength and Curtis's calculated rage became a reminder that in the world of General Hospital, no betrayal goes unanswered, and no villain escapes the consequences of his own making. As Drew pressed forward with his relentless investigation, convinced Stella was on the verge of collapse, he unknowingly began to expose the very weaknesses that would undo him. His obsession with victory blinded him to the careful maneuvering happening behind the scenes. Stella and Curtis, far from being defeated, had already begun weaving together an intricate web of deception, a labyrinth so detailed that once Drew stepped into it, there would be no way out. They enlisted allies both within the hospital and across the legal system, trusted individuals who could manipulate files, redirect evidence, and fabricate plausible leads that would make Drew appear not as an accuser, but as the mastermind of a larger, more insidious fraud scheme. At first, the changes were subtle: small inconsistencies in reports, strange financial irregularities, and whispers in administrative corridors that began to place Drew in the wrong light. He thought these were minor obstacles, but each one was deliberately placed to erode his credibility. As Curtis quietly leaked misleading information into the networks Drew relied on, contracts that once seemed secure crumbled without warning. Investments Drew had boasted about began to falter, undone by phantom clauses and manipulated agreements. Business partners who once trusted him suddenly grew wary, withdrawing support under the pressure of supposed evidence that tied him to corruption. By the time Drew realized these failures were not coincidence, his foundation of wealth and influence had already begun to rot. Curtis's brilliance lay in his restraint. He did not charge at Drew openly, for that would only give Drew a clear enemy to fight against. Instead, Curtis allowed the illusion to play out, letting Drew's paranoia drive him into making costly mistakes. Stella, still outwardly fragile and dependent on recovery, played her role with perfection. Her vulnerability evoked sympathy throughout the hospital and the broader community, while Drew was cast as the ruthless aggressor who had driven her into this state. The contrast was stark: Stella, beloved and weak yet dignified, versus Drew, powerful but increasingly seen as predatory and cruel. The community's opinion shifted decisively. What Drew thought would be his triumph became a public relations disaster. As the days passed, every move Drew made to defend himself only tightened the noose Curtis and Stella had drawn around his neck. Each explanation he offered was met with skepticism, each denial drowned out by the growing pile of fabricated but convincing evidence. Court documents appeared implicating him in larger-scale insurance manipulations, forged contracts tied his name to fraudulent claims, and even encrypted communications seemed to surface, all pointing to his guilt. Curtis had ensured that the trail of falsehoods was seamless, sophisticated enough to withstand scrutiny and damning enough to strip Drew of any chance to escape. The tragedy for Drew was that his downfall felt like self-destruction. He had walked so confidently into the role of executioner, believing Stella had already been defeated, that he never questioned why every door he opened led him deeper into suspicion. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that Curtis and Stella were quietly guiding him step by step into his own undoing. What had begun as an attack on Stella's integrity had transformed into a mirror reflecting Drew's corruption back at him. Now, in the eyes of Port Charles, Drew was no longer the whistleblower, he was the criminal. The deeper he sank, the more isolated he became. Former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to share the fallout of his collapse. Even those who had once stood by him, bound by loyalty or obligation, began to see him as a liability. Every appeal he made for support rang hollow, and every attempt to rally strength only highlighted how far he had fallen. The very power he had once used to intimidate and control now became a weight dragging him into ruin. Curtis had achieved exactly what he wanted. Drew was destroying himself, piece by piece, without Curtis ever needing to land a visible blow. For Stella, the irony was poignant. She had been painted as frail, accused of dishonesty, and nearly driven to death by Drew's cruelty, yet she emerged as the hidden architect of his downfall. Her alliance with Curtis not only preserved her dignity but also turned her suffering into the spark that ignited Drew's collapse. She had let him underestimate her, let him believe she was helpless, while all along she was part of the machine dismantling his empire. In the end, Drew's transformation from accuser to accused was more than just poetic justice, it was a carefully orchestrated reckoning. The man who once stood so sure of his own power was left stripped of reputation, wealth, and allies, undone not by brute force but by the elegance of a trap he never even knew was set. Stella and Curtis had not simply defeated him, they had redefined the battlefield, proving that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not open confrontation, but the quiet, patient art of letting a man walk into his own ruin. What made the story spiral into even more gripping drama was that Curtis and Stella refused to stop at merely dismantling Drew's reputation. They knew that stripping away his public image was only the first step. To truly end him, they needed to take away the foundation he had always relied upon: the loyalty and trust of his allies. Carefully, methodically, they set about turning Drew's closest supporters into his greatest liabilities. Rumors were seeded in whispered tones, documents were leaked at just the right moments, and subtle suggestions of danger spread through every corner of Port Charles. Those who had once sworn allegiance to Drew began to feel the weight of suspicion. Aligning with him no longer promised power or security, instead, it threatened exposure and ruin. The brilliance of Curtis and Stella's maneuvering was that none of it appeared to come directly from them. Instead, it seemed as if fate itself had turned against Drew, though in truth it was their calculated hands steering events. One by one, Drew's old allies distanced themselves, eager to protect their own interests. Conversations that had once been warm grew cold, invitations ceased, and doors once open to him now quietly shut. What had been an inner circle of influence dissolved, leaving Drew stranded in a widening desert of isolation. The chilling part for him was not that strangers doubted him, it was that even those he had trusted the most began to treat him as if he were toxic. Martin, perhaps the most devastating loss among Drew's connections, became a symbol of that shift. Stella had once risked her own standing to shield Martin, providing him with the support he needed when no one else would. Drew had thought Martin's loyalty was unbreakable, a tether to legitimacy in the midst of scandal. But as Stella's carefully orchestrated trap unfolded, Martin faced a choice: cling to Drew and be dragged down with him, or cut ties to preserve his own survival. In the end, self-preservation won. Martin, once Drew's strongest defender, quietly withdrew his support, sending a shockwave through the already fractured network of alliances. If even Martin had abandoned him, what hope did Drew have of convincing others to stand by him? For Drew, the realization struck with brutal clarity: he had been maneuvered out of the very game he believed he controlled. Port Charles, once a landscape he thought he could manipulate at will, now seemed alien and hostile. Every handshake felt like a test, every glance carried doubt, and every whispered conversation left him more paranoid. The empire of influence he had built through intimidation, charm, and manipulation had turned to dust before his eyes. He had not only lost control but also the trust of those who had once bolstered his rise. Trust, after all, was the currency of power, and Drew's account had been drained to nothing. Meanwhile, Stella's recovery became more than a personal victory, it was a public statement of resilience. As she gradually regained her strength, her very presence radiated a sense of triumph. What was supposed to be her downfall had instead transformed into her rebirth. Port Charles saw her not as a victim of Drew's machinations but as a symbol of endurance, someone who had faced betrayal, physical collapse, and humiliation, yet emerged stronger than before. Her recovery became an inspiration, not only to those closest to her but to the broader community who rallied around her. In their eyes, Stella embodied the proof that goodness, persistence, and quiet strength could withstand even the most ruthless assault. Curtis stood proudly at her side, no longer simply the angry avenger but the steady protector who had fought back with intelligence and patience. Together, they had shown Port Charles that unity, loyalty, and strategy could dismantle arrogance and greed. Their alliance was no longer defined by reaction to Drew's cruelty but by a proactive stand against corruption and manipulation. Stella's return to strength marked the end of Drew's dominance and the dawn of a new era in which those who had been underestimated seized back control. For Drew, the contrast was unbearable. He had once envisioned himself as the master of every chessboard in town, the player who could bend others to his will with a mixture of force and persuasion. But now he was left with nothing but fragments, shattered trust, broken alliances, and the echo of a name that no longer commanded respect. His empire of influence had collapsed, and worse, no one remained at his side to help him rebuild it. In Port Charles, a man without allies is a man without power, and Drew had been reduced to a shadow of the force he once believed himself to be. The irony was cruel but undeniable. In trying to destroy Stella, Drew had set into motion the very forces that would destroy him. His downfall was not the product of one strike but of countless small cuts, each carefully inflicted by Stella and Curtis until there was nothing left. Where once he had inspired fear, now he inspired pity, and in the ruthless world of Port Charles, pity was the final insult. Stella and Curtis had not only survived, they had prevailed, and in doing so, they proved that even the most dangerous tyrant can be undone by the quiet strength of those he underestimates. The intricate play Stella and Curtis crafted against Drew was not merely the story of one man's downfall, it was the reshaping of an entire social order within Port Charles. What began as a targeted retaliation transformed into a sweeping statement about justice, loyalty, and the fragility of power. The victory did not only bring Drew to his knees, it elevated Stella and Curtis to positions of symbolic prominence in ways neither could have anticipated. The shift was so dramatic that it altered the way the community viewed not just them, but the entire dynamic of power in the city. Yet at the same time, victory carried shadows, for in defeating Drew they had set into motion consequences that reached far beyond the personal. Curtis, long perceived as a man torn between his impulses and his responsibilities, became the unexpected figure of strength and vision. To those around him, his ability to strike back at Drew without succumbing to reckless violence set him apart from others who had faced similar betrayals in the past. He had chosen strategy over brute force, patience over rage, and in doing so, he revealed a side of himself that demanded respect. Friends and family began to look at him as more than a protector, they saw him as a leader, someone who had taken control of a chaotic situation and bent it toward justice. This transformation reshaped his standing within Port Charles, marking him as both a survivor and a man capable of building legacies from ashes. For Stella, her arc was even more profound. She had gone from the brink of death to embodying the indomitable spirit of resilience. The heart attack that nearly claimed her life had paradoxically become the turning point that saved her reputation and gave her new purpose. To many, Stella became the embodiment of endurance, a woman who refused to be destroyed by betrayal, who transformed pain into power, and who stood as living proof that cruelty could never silence integrity. Her recovery was not just physical, it was symbolic. Each step she took back into her life was a reminder to Port Charles that no force, no matter how ruthless, could diminish the quiet strength of someone who fought for justice. The collapse of Drew was orchestrated with meticulous precision, and the destruction of his reputation was only the beginning. Curtis and Stella's plan struck deeper, unraveling every layer of his power. Former allies turned away, not because they suddenly discovered morality, but because the carefully woven trap made loyalty to Drew synonymous with self-destruction. Business associates cut ties, social connections withered, and even his closest confidants saw the danger in standing beside him. Martin, the most symbolic of all these allies, withdrew from Drew's orbit in a move that felt like betrayal but was ultimately self-preservation. The loss of Martin was more than personal, it was strategic, for without Martin's support, Drew no longer had a veneer of legitimacy to shield him. The betrayal cemented his isolation and accelerated his unraveling. But what made the situation so perilous was not the loss of reputation or allies, it was what those losses created within Drew himself. A man stripped of everything he values, humiliated in public and broken in private, is a man capable of unimaginable retaliation. The very qualities that once fueled Drew's rise, his intelligence, his resourcefulness, his cunning, remained intact, though now twisted by bitterness and desperation. He had been reduced to nothing, and yet in that nothingness lay the seed of danger.